Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now you might think that you need a top tier graphics card to enjoy games on a high refresh rate, high resolution monitor, but it totally depends on what you're playing. Counter-Strike 2 for example runs really well on this 5120 by 1440 144Hz display with my RTX 4060, albeit with low settings, but I think it looks and feels amazing. But what if you have something older? Take for example this GTX 980. Once a $549 powerhouse, this decade-old Maxwell card is best suited to 1080p in 2024, but today we'll be pushing it a little harder. The first question was, would it even support 5120 by 1440? The answer to that is yes, albeit at a maximum of 60Hz. Not too concerning because I can't imagine we'll be hitting 60 FPS or beyond all that much today, but we'll give it a go. I'll let you in on a not so secret. This interesting eBay find was at some point modded by the previous owner and now has 8GB of VRAM instead of 4. That may help us a bit, but ultimately we could be limited by the fact that this is still a 10-year-old 980, but let's see. So first of all then we have Crysis. This is the original 2007 release. I thought I'd start off easy on the 980 here. Now this does support the 5120 by 1440p resolution, and with this card it runs with at least 60 frames per second, 64 on average. I've only recorded the average today. I didn't bother benchmarking it exactly with all the 1 and 0.1% lows because I wasn't sure this was actually going to work. So I jumped in, took an average of all the games I played today, put the settings up on screen as well, and for our first result, well, I am pretty impressed. Crysis still holds up really nicely, almost drove the truck over the cliff there. That happens sometimes. High settings across the board apart from post-processing, which was set to medium so that I could turn motion blur off. And as you can see, well, I think it still looks absolutely fantastic. Still a great looking game. I mean, a decade and a half after it launched, and it works well on the 980 and this monitor. Counter-Strike 2 next. You saw this running on the RTX 4060 at the start of this video. Here we're running it on the low settings yet again, this time hitting an average of 130 frames per second. So it's not quite enough here to constantly maintain 144 FPS to match the refresh rate of the monitor, but it doesn't really matter when the card only outputs at 60Hz anyway at this resolution. We can't really feel these extra frames. That said, I do think it still looks great at low settings, especially at this nice, sharp and crisp resolution. I have made a video on this before. This did get sent to me for a review and I'll leave a link to that original review down below. I thought I'd give this another test, this time with an older card of course, because I've been wondering how it would do for a long time and I absolutely love using this thing. CS2 on the 980, this old modified card. As you can see, it is assigning more than 4 gigs of VRAM here. The VRAM usage, however, is slightly less than 3 gigabytes, but it's running fairly consistently with a solid enough average. With Forza Horizon 5, I started with the medium preset, but that was a bit too intense on the card, so I dropped down to low, and it still didn't really make much of a difference to the frame rate. We probably saw 5 FPS more. That was a bad idea. I'm going to land sideways. Yep, absolutely destroyed the car there. Now in some instances we will see at least 60 frames per second. On the open road, that is, we're going to see a far higher frame rate. In more busy areas like you saw at the start of the Horizon Festival area, this will drop to the low 40s. We do have FSR here to use. I'm not sure why I didn't utilise it, to be fair. I think it's because after playing a while the frame rate was pretty close to 60 FPS, but it turns out it was actually more closer to 52 overall. Still at the low settings, I think this looks pretty decent and runs fairly well also. Forza Horizon 5 is my second favourite, probably to Forza Horizon 4. Maybe I'm a bit biased because that was set in the good old British countryside, and being from England, of course, I have to side with that one. But Forza Horizon 5 here runs... Wow, that just suddenly stopped me, that random shack in the middle of the desert. Never mind, can we switch camera angle? Yeah, this looks pretty cool as well. Even at low settings, it still looks decent and feels pretty nice to play on this beastie monitor. Next up then we have GTA 5. Now this one is running at the high settings. The detail sliders are turned up to full, MSAA is off, FXAA is on, and the advanced graphics options are all turned off for an average of 64 frames per second. This game I think still holds up pretty well visually in 2024, showing its age in some areas of course, but the good thing about it is that it can be made to run on a wide range of hardware. Even still, you can fire this up on an old 9800 GT for example and get a decent frame rate, and also you can turn the graphics right up on say a modern 4070 and get a good looking game that's going to run really nicely with a super high refresh rate too. Also, on the 980 here, it's running with at least 60 frames per second at high settings at this very high resolution, which is nice. I'm loving this extra wide field of view today. And now we come to the benchmarks where we have to make more of a visual sacrifice in terms of the resolution. This is either through FSR or through turning the render resolution down a little bit. We'll start off with Call of Duty Black Ops 6 with the basic preset. We're running at 50% res scale here for an average of 44 FPS. Now this game has FSR, it has FSR 3, XeSS, DLSS. We can only use FSR or XeSS with this card, or we could turn the render res down, and that's what I ended up doing. 50% of 5120 by 1440, so it's like 2560 by 720, something like that. My maths is terrible, so it's probably wildly incorrect, but it feels okay to play. Not the best sub 60 FPS and certainly not ideal for an online competitive title, but it didn't stop me wiping out a few enemies, and to be honest, it does still look fairly good on this screen. The 980 is holding up fairly well. Cyberpunk 2077 was a pretty surprising result. Here we are with the lowest settings, FSR 2.1 and set to performance mode. So not ultra performance, just performance mode here today for an average of 39 FPS. I had a target of 30 FPS in mind in these more demanding games. I knew I'd have to use FSR, so there is a lot of upscaling involved, but the nice thing is we can still maintain that super wide aspect ratio. So although we are upscaling, we're upscaling on a pretty wide monitor and it still feels pretty decent to play. Although we aren't quite hitting the maximum 60Hz output here, it does still seem quite enjoyable, to be honest, and I have just absolutely made a mess of my vehicle. Every time I get in a car, the cops, whoever else, start chasing me. I must have done something to upset someone, but let's get out of here. Red Dead Redemption 2 up next. Now I always try and stick with the ultra textures if I can, and I did that here, but I did have to set everything else to low. FSR 2 isn't always the most helpful in this game for whatever reason, doesn't tend to make as much of an impact as it does in others, but here with balanced it meant the difference between a sub 30 FPS and a plus 30 FPS average, so you could definitely lock it at 30 FPS and it would feel a lot better than having that unlocked frame rate that's all over the place, especially when we're outputting at 60 Hertz. But yeah, the 980 here doing pretty well. As you can see, we are using at least 4 gigs of VRAM, so the extra 4 gigs on this modified card is coming in handy, put it that way, and the frame rate is better than anything you're going to find on consoles at the moment. I don't think there's a 60 FPS patch or anything or update like that, so at 33 on average, we're getting better than the PS5 and probably a sharper visual image, though graphically, settings-wise, not as good. And we will finalise with our worst result of the day, but also in a way the most surprising. This is Starfield at low with FSR 3 and 50% resolution scaling at 22 FPS overall. Now we could enable frame generation, and I did try that, but it felt absolutely horrendous. We were still getting 22 FPS of course, but where the game was trying to sort of, where the hardware was trying to generate frames in that sense, it felt like a stuttery, blurry, just a weird sort of artificially smooth mess that felt more like 16 frames per second. That was a very specific number, let's say 10 frames per second, than it did 22. What I'm trying to say is that it felt a lot worse and wasn't ideal. So 50% res and FSR 3 was the best place to be, although not an ideal outcome, but a decent effort for the 980, a decade-old high-end GPU, that's for sure. But there we go, the 980, an old high-end card on a ultra-wide screen display. I think it held up fairly well. If you're looking to play those older or esports titles, it's going to do okay, and classics such as GTA 5 will also run relatively well with decent graphical settings too. But that's all for this one. Let me know your thoughts down below. This is not a sponsored video or anything like that. I've actually reviewed this before, but I was just revisiting it because I love to use this thing. Really handy for editing and the like. But I'll leave a link. Thank you, as always. I'll see you next time.